Good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank all the conveners of this very enlightening conference, Paula, David, Sam, and Arya. I'm delighted to be here, and thanks also to my fellow panelists for their very interesting presentations. Today, I'm going to speak about a project I created during my recently completed practice-based PhD at the Glasgow School of Art, specifically the Iraq Photo Archive and House of Memory VR. I'm going to begin with some background information to contextualize my recent practice before moving on to discuss this research. My art practice at its core is interested in how archive photographs can be activated as touchstones of memory. From this starting point, I use different methodologies to try to create what I like to call expanded photographic moments, using physical objects, films, computer-generated animations, and interactive works. Image research forms a large part of my work, particularly collections of archive images from Iraq. In the course of one of these searches, I came across this black and white archive photograph in the Library of Congress collection. It's taken at Bab al-Ghurghur in northern Iraq in 1932, at the site of Iraq's first oil discovery. It depicts natural gas fires seeping through cracks in the rocks, eternal flames believed to have burned for at least 4,000 years. These perpetual flames heralded the birth of Iraq's oil industry and are still burning today. The archive photograph condenses geological time and the origins of current Middle Eastern geopolitical conflicts, economic ideology, and environmental catastrophe. From this image, I created this work using Unreal Engine, a video game engine. It's a meditation on the technology used both in military conflict training and gaming. It begins as a macro view, slowly tracking back to reveal a simulation of the landscape as based on the original photograph. The work creates a virtual bond with the past, transporting the viewer to a temporal space that encourages reflection on the provenance of current traumas. This work was a turning point in my practice towards using virtual technology to reconstruct and temporally and spatially expand archive photographs. There are several different archival repositories of photographs of Iraq, both on and offline, administered by formal bodies such as universities or private individuals. During my search of archives for photographs from Iraq, I found many collections from the early 20th century showing Iraq at a moment in time, pre-modernity, pre-oil industry, with many traditional ways of life depicted. Many of these images were, of course, taken with a colonial lens, and they come with their own politics. They represent an ethnographic record of this period of Iraqi history. They also document and record an architectural record of buildings and places that have since been either destroyed or left to decay. It's crucial to note that significant formal archival collections of photographs from Iraq are held outside of the country. Prior to the US military occupation in 2003, the Iraq National Library and Archive was in a state of neglect due to years of underfunding, corruption, and the ideological needs of the Ba'ath Party. The NLA suffered a great deal of cultural destruction in the immediate aftermath of the US military invasion and occupation, particularly in the days following the arrival of US troops into Baghdad in April 2003. The former Director General of the NLA, Saad Eskander, describes how in the space of 3 days, Iraq's NLA forever lost about 60% of its archival materials, hundreds of thousands of archival documents, historical records, and rare books, a large portion of modern Iraq's historical memory, which he described as a national disaster on a large scale, losses which cannot be compensated. He also reports that fires destroyed almost all of the NLA's collection of historical photographs and maps. One of the legacies of decades of conflict in Iraq is that mass media representations of the country, particularly in Western news and entertainment media, are skewed towards images of violence, destruction, and trauma. The portrayal of the First Gulf War in the news media gave it the moniker of the video game war, particularly the point-of-view imagery of so-called smart bombs and night vision coverage of missile strikes. Images from these wars have become so iconic, they inform a visual parlance and a reference point for content within military-themed video games, as well as representing a visual shorthand for military concepts like shock and awe. Being half Iraqi and growing up in Ireland, my visual impression of Iraq was informed by a dichotomy of sources. News and game media images of burning oil fields, Saddam Hussein and American airstrikes on the one hand, and my father's personal photo albums and associated familial stories on the other. My father was an avid photographer of the landscape as he was a geologist, but also of people and occasions. The photographs in his albums from his youth showed a perspective on Iraq that was very different from what I was seeing through Western media in Ireland. The images showed everyday universal stories of life, field trips at college, sports days, family occasions, and so on. The stories he told me about Iraq, together with these photographs from his albums and the conversations around them, played a very important role in helping me to understand this part of my identity. And they also highlighted for me the potential of personal photo collections for the construction of collective community histories through the communication of authentic individual narratives. There's widespread circulation of digitized historical photographs from Iraq across countless pages on different social platforms. These pages share thousands of old images in multiple genres, including Orientalist images from the 19th and 20th century, mid-20th century images of the Kingdom of Iraq, advertising posters, as well as private family photographs. The sheer volume of images and number of followers indicates a deep interest in old photographs from Iraq, an archive fever, if you will. The Instagram pages @IraqiArchive and @ArchiveIraqi, with hundreds of thousands of followers, are particularly active, and they post a very broad range of imagery. The photos on these pages are all generally annotated in Arabic, superimposing descriptive information about the image and watermarking with the Instagram handle of the respective page. There are various generations of digital copy that are flowing across these sites, sometimes with different watermarks depending on which site claims the original point of sharing. As a result, the original images are difficult to locate within this network, and it's almost impossible to ascertain their provenance. This volume of informal archiving and circulation of images across social media, together with my own personal experiences, led me to create the Iraq Photo Archive, which was the first key element of my PhD research. And this archive began with a series of photographs from my father's own personal collection. And the platform attempts a curation of vernacular images from Iraqi diaspora, where the contributor has a direct connection to the image, either through being in the photograph, taking the photograph, a subject in the image, or a relative of either. Creating a moderated website for participants to engage with aims to ensure as much as possible the veracity of the provenance of the images. This online platform invited Iraqis, initially in the diaspora, to share photos from their personal collections, together with associated narratives. Over 500 images have been submitted to date, as well as old 8mm film footage. And Instagram was the primary platform used to disseminate the project and encourage submissions to the website. Participants submitted images and were invited to describe it as they saw fit, together with approximate locations and dates. Interestingly, it didn't take long for images from this collection to begin to circulate on the other archive pages with modified descriptions, sometimes entirely fictional. Following their photographic contributions, I invited participants to take part in an oral history interview about their memories of the photographic moment. Using the photograph as a touchstone for memory retrieval brought forth a flow of memories related to the moment of the photograph, which expands the photograph with the subject's narrative. The oral history interviews used the photo elicitation method. This approach focused the discussion to the photographic moment depicted, in order to forefront narratives of the everyday by recording memories associated to this one temporal event, small stories, rather than grander or broader narratives. The photograph functions as an anchor point in the interview, which used semi-structured interview questions to prompt discussion and guide the conversation back to the narratives related to the image where necessary. While the online archive created a crowdsourced collection of authentic images and narratives from Iraqis, the next phase of the project was concerned with temporally and spatially expanding the photographs. The choice of VR for the remediation of the memory material was motivated by the idea of creating an immersive and experiential encounter with an individual's narrative. Bochner and Riggs contend, creating an experiential encounter privileges the standpoint of the storyteller and creates the conditions for an empathetic encounter to emerge. The choice of VR was also informed by the desire to counter the dominant representation of Iraqi environments within conflict-themed video games and military training simulations. Digital representations of Iraq are almost exclusively associated with the country as a site of conflict, be it representations within military training simulations, backdrops for first-person shooter games and combat flight simulators, or digital heritage preservation and reconstruction of cultural heritage sites damaged or destroyed due to conflict. There are myriad computer-generated or virtual depictions of Iraq, specifically in video games, which have drawn on conflict in the country as storylines and settings for predominantly tactical shooter-style video games, such as Desert Strike, Call of Duty, Battlefield, and Conflict Desert Storm. This trend extends from the 1980s right up to today, with the recently released 6 Days in Fallujah, which takes the infamous Second Battle of Fallujah in winter 2004 as the setting for its first-person tactical shooter, and the very soon-to-be-announced new game in the Call of Duty franchise, Black Ops Gulf War, which is set, of course, during the first Gulf War in 1990. The intersection of military simulations within video game entertainment is particularly evident in Virtual Iraq, a set of VR environments created by the Institute for Creative Technologies at the University of Southern California to treat PTSD in combat veterans who served in Iraq and Afghanistan. Virtual Iraq integrated game assets from America's Army, a first-person tactical shooter published by the US Army as a platform for recruitment, and Full Spectrum Warrior, another first-person tactical shooter and commercially successful Xbox video game, which originated from a US military training game. Highly accurate 3D models of Iraq exist in the form of military training simulations, such as those created by the American firm MVR Simulation. They created a virtual Baghdad using satellite and Landsat imagery to create a high-resolution, geospecific replica of a portion of Baghdad for enhanced warfighter training experiences and opportunities prior to deployment. Mention here must be made of the latest game in the Assassin's Creed franchise, Mirage, which is principally set in 9th century Baghdad during the Islamic Golden Age and foregrounds well-researched reconstructions of ancient cultural heritage. In order to design the virtual environment, I considered that the experience I was designing required a central virtual environment from which remediations could be interacted with. This space should allow users to freely explore and get used to the basic functionality, and it should also provide temporal space for the user to pause for reflection in between interaction with the remediations. I based the design of this virtual space upon an element of traditional Iraqi tangible cultural heritage, that of the Baghdadi Shanashil house. The core of this traditional house is a central courtyard, around which rooms are oriented across 3 stories. This vernacular courtyard's domestic space, as a conceptual stage for stories to be enacted upon, seemed to be an appropriate device for encounters with personal photographs and associated narratives. Additionally, this type of structure is evocative of Iraq, with specific architectural design elements present both in palatial structures and in vernacular buildings from Mosul to Baghdad and Basra. With many of these structures in a state of disrepair, decay, or destroyed entirely, the construction of a virtual model of this Shanashil also serves as a form of digital heritage visualization. And furthermore, their use in this context provides a representation of these environments which is not contextualized as a stage for simulated conflict. Using a variety of sources from historical paintings, conservation project photos, and architectural floor plans, I set about designing the central virtual portal for the remediated photos and stories. A prototype was initially created based on the reference material to experiment with the scale and layout of the environment in Unreal Engine. The prototype contained a large amount of architectural detail, and constructing these assets would have required a lengthy production time, beyond the time scale of my PhD. With only 2 remediations being presented, the new design was based around a simplified courtyard with navigation limited to just the ground floor, reducing the number of textured assets required considerably. I 3D modeled objects for this environment based off reference drawings and photographs, and using a modular asset workflow combined with unique asset production. As well as this modeling workflow, I also appropriated some ready-made game assets used to construct generic Middle Eastern environments for first-person shooter games. Several acquired assets were used across the levels to create a visually accurate and appealing environment. Using acquired assets served 2 functions. Firstly, to reduce the amount of production time required, but secondly, and more importantly, to counter the use of certain digital assets designed for the creation of so-called military operation urban training scenarios in generic Arabian environments. I appropriated 12 assets from this Arabian pack and used them across 3 scenes in the experience. All of these 3D objects were then used to construct the 3 virtual environments present, the courtyard of the house and 2 expanded photographic environments. And here you can see the development from photographic reference to prototype to final model. As there were 17 images discussed in total from the interviews I conducted, it was decided that remediating all 17 would be unachievable within the time frame of the research. And as a result, I created a criteria for inclusion and exclusion to mitigate bias. The 3 criteria were the content of the image, the complexity of the image, and the content of the interview excerpt. And these were the 2 images that fulfilled the criteria I had set. And prior to remediating the photos and associated narratives into the VR environment, I carried out a detailed reading of images to classify a list of elements for 3D reconstruction. Basic denotational reading was carried out to classify the non-subject elements within the frame. Interviews were analyzed for contextual information, describing the specific physical and oral elements of the environment of the photograph as recalled by the participant. And then from this, a list of props and sounds was drawn up and used to populate the scenes. Viewers enter the virtual courtyard of the house, and upon interaction with a photograph in the space, they are transported into a virtual reconstruction of the photograph, together with an audio narration from an individual in the photo. The design of these environments was informed by the information derived during the image analysis process, using the denotational information in the photograph combined with the contextual information from the interview. I placed the photograph as a 3D object within the virtual space and created an environment around it, containing the elements described in the narration. The placement and orientation of objects were informed by the narrative, as well as creative and aesthetic decisions based on how they would compositionally complement each other and how the logic of their spatial relationship to the composition of the photograph. When the experience was built, it was then shared with the core participants in the project in Dublin, London, and Glasgow to evaluate the response to the whole participatory process. The responses were all very encouraging and spoke of similar desires of wanting to share images and narratives which would counter some of the representations within the media. Evaluations demonstrated that the medium of VR immersed users emotively in their personal stories, and the experience created conditions for deeper understanding, presented different perspectives, and brought the stories to life with the authentic voices. And these are some of the participant responses. The research has shown how curating an online space to crowdsource personal photos can energize and engage the Iraqi diaspora community to construct a photo archive that is representative of their personal histories. The website enables global accessibility, which can offer those in the diaspora spaces where they can feel represented and connected to community histories across national boundaries. The archive reveals the potential for personal images and narratives to create counter-stories to dominant narratives and media representations of Iraq. The methodology forefronts the value of situated knowledge in the reconstruction of a virtual environment, representative of a place or time in the past, and demonstrates the potential for an experiential encounter with memory in VR and the emotive impact this can have on viewers. It foregrounds personal narratives to expand photographs into immersive temporal environments where personal memory can resonate within a digital materiality. The project demonstrates the use of immersive technology to activate touchstones of memory and communicate individual narratives and hidden histories to wider communities. And in doing so, it helps to build collective community histories and counter archives to form wider understanding of Iraqi stories beyond one-dimensional media representations, and to challenge the dominant representation of Iraqi environments and culture within computer-generated media, such as video games. The archive is an ongoing project and has recently received a large collection of the images from the Music and Ballet School of Baghdad. And the House of Memory is currently in its first iteration and is being expanded to include further images and recorded interviews, with the goal that it can be made accessible on VR platforms for widespread dissemination. Thank you very much.